Visitors don't sit in command meetings. The words echoed across the command floor of the Metropolitan Police Headquarters, sharp enough to stop every conversation in the room. For a moment, even the steady hum of computers and police radios seemed to fade into the background. More than 30 officers and department supervisors turned toward the source of the voice. Standing near the front of the room, Police Chief Richard Hayes adjusted the cuff of his Navy uniform and stared directly at the woman who had just stepped through the double glass doors. Danielle Brooks stopped walking. She held a slim leather folder against her side and wore a charcoal gray business suit that looked understated compared to the sea of decorated uniforms surrounding her. Rain from outside still clung to the shoulders of her coat, tiny droplets catching the fluorescent lights overhead. She didn't speak. She simply met Hayes's gaze. The silence stretched for a second longer. Then a few people near the back of the room chuckled. Hayes pointed toward a side table where coffee urns and paper cups had been arranged for the morning briefing. "Staff entrance is down the hall," he added. "You're in the wrong room." More laughter followed, nervous this time, the kind that came from people who knew better than to disagree with the most powerful man in the building. Danielle remained perfectly still. The expression on her face never changed. She neither smiled nor frowned. She simply observed. Outside the large windows overlooking downtown Baltimore, gray clouds pressed low against the skyline. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, the command center felt colder than the weather outside. Hayes looked around the room, clearly pleased with himself. For nearly 12 years, he had ruled the department with absolute confidence. Promotions passed through his office. Careers rose or fell based on his opinion. Officers respected him. Some feared him. Most did both. His reputation filled every hallway in the building long before he entered it. That reputation was exactly why nobody questioned him now. Nobody except the woman standing quietly near the doorway. Danielle slowly bent down and picked up the visitor badge that had slipped from her coat pocket moments earlier. The plastic card swung gently from its lanyard as she straightened. Her eyes moved across the room. Rows of command staff. Captains. Lieutenants. Detectives. City officials. Not one person seemed willing to interrupt what was happening. She had seen rooms like this before. Different cities. Different departments. Different leaders. The details changed, but the atmosphere rarely did. Power had a way of making people comfortable with silence. Hayes folded his arms. "Well," he asked, "did you get lost?" The room laughed again, this time louder. Danielle's fingers tightened slightly around the folder she carried. Not from anger. Not from embarrassment. From patience. The polished wood conference table reflected the bright ceiling lights like a sheet of still water. Somewhere near the back wall, a radio crackled with dispatch traffic before falling silent again. Danielle glanced briefly toward the department seal mounted behind the podium. Then she looked back at Hayes. Calm, composed, unshaken, as if she knew something nobody else in the room knew. And in less than an hour, every person inside that command center would wish they had paid closer attention. Danielle Brooks had spent most of her career walking into rooms where people had already decided who she was before she ever spoke a word. The difference was that she had learned long ago not to fight those assumptions immediately. Sometimes the truth arrived with more power when it was allowed to reveal itself. She moved toward an empty seat near the end of the conference table and placed her leather folder carefully on the polished surface. Around her, conversations resumed in low voices. Some officers glanced her way before quickly looking elsewhere. Others openly stared, trying to figure out why a woman they had never seen before seemed completely unaffected by the awkward introduction she had just received. Danielle noticed all of it. She always did. Years of investigative work had taught her to pay attention to the details people overlooked. The nervous tapping of fingers, the exchanged glances, the hesitation before someone spoke. Those small things often revealed far more than official reports ever could. She rested one hand lightly on the folder. Inside were hundreds of pages of documents she had reviewed during the previous week. Internal complaints, audit findings, performance reviews, anonymous statements, patterns hidden beneath numbers and signatures. The kind of information most people never saw. The kind that explained why she had been sent here in the first place. Outside, rain continued to streak down the tall windows overlooking the city. The gray morning light reflected off the conference room walls, giving everything a muted, almost metallic appearance. Danielle remembered another rainy morning nearly 20 years earlier. Back then, she had been a rookie investigator working out of a cramped office on Chicago's South Side. The building had leaked whenever storms rolled through. Buckets sat in hallways catching water from the ceiling. Nobody cared about appearances there. People cared about results. Her father used to tell her the same thing when she was growing up. Marcus Brooks had spent 30 years as a firefighter. He never cared much for titles. Every evening, he came home smelling faintly of smoke and engine oil. Whenever Danielle complained about unfair treatment, he would simply smile and say, "Character survives long after opinions change." She had carried those words with her ever since. The conference room door opened, and several city officials entered carrying tablets and briefing packets. Chairs shifted. Coffee cups clinked softly against saucers. The morning meeting was about to begin. At the front of the room, Richard Hayes stood confidently beside a large digital display showing department statistics. His silver hair was perfectly combed. His uniform looked pressed straight from a ceremony. He carried himself like a man who expected every eye in the room to follow him. Most did. Hayes began speaking about public safety initiatives, budget allocations, and staffing shortages. His voice filled the room effortlessly. Officers nodded along. Department heads took notes. Yet Danielle noticed something else. Every time difficult topics appeared on the screen, Hayes moved through them quickly. Certain numbers received detailed explanations. Others disappeared almost immediately. Small details, easy to miss, unless someone was specifically looking for them. Danielle quietly opened her folder and reviewed a few pages. A captain seated nearby glanced down and noticed the department seal printed across several documents. His expression changed slightly. Confusion replaced amusement. He looked from the papers to Danielle and then toward Hayes. For the first time that morning, uncertainty entered the room. It was subtle, barely visible, but it was there, and Danielle knew it would only grow stronger as the day unfolded. The morning briefing moved forward, but the energy inside the command center had begun to shift. It was almost impossible to notice at first. A glance held a second longer than usual. A whispered conversation cut short when someone approached. A supervisor quietly rereading a page that had suddenly become important. Danielle sat silently while the room continued orbiting around Chief Richard Hayes. At the front of the room, he spoke with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his position. Charts flashed across the large screen behind him. Crime trends, budget requests, recruitment numbers. Every slide reinforced the same message. The department was functioning because he was leading it. At least that was the story he wanted everyone to believe. Hayes paced slowly across the front of the room, one hand resting on the podium as he addressed the command staff. His polished shoes barely made a sound against the floor. Every sentence seemed rehearsed. Every answer arrived before the question was fully asked. Around him, department leaders nodded in agreement. Some appeared impressed. Others simply appeared careful. Danielle recognized the difference. She had spent too many years interviewing witnesses, reviewing testimony, and observing people under pressure not to. The captain seated 2 chairs away from her continued glancing toward the documents inside her folder. Eventually, curiosity overcame caution. Leaning slightly in her direction, he lowered his voice. "Are you with the city administration?" Danielle looked up from her notes. "Something like that," she replied calmly. The captain nodded but did not seem satisfied. Before he could ask another question, Hayes's voice cut through the room again. "The reality is simple," the chief announced. "Strong leadership creates strong departments." Several people offered polite applause. Danielle remained still. Through the windows, rain continued sliding down the glass in thin silver lines. Baltimore's skyline appeared blurred beneath the storm clouds. The city looked distant, almost hidden. For a brief moment, Danielle thought about the long drive she had made from Washington the previous evening. Nearly 40 miles of highway, headlights reflecting off wet pavement. Hours spent reviewing reports at a hotel desk while most of the city slept. She had arrived prepared. What surprised her was not the resistance she expected to encounter. It was how quickly she had identified its source. Hayes moved to the next slide. A photograph appeared on the screen showing officers participating in a community outreach event. Smiling faces, handshakes, positive headlines. The image looked perfect. Too perfect. Danielle quietly turned a page inside her folder. Behind that photograph sat a very different story. Unresolved complaints. Missing documentation. Inconsistent disciplinary records. Not catastrophic problems, but enough questions to concern federal oversight officials. Enough questions to bring her here. Near the back of the room, a young lieutenant raised his hand. "Chief, what about the review request from the Inspector General's office?" The room became noticeably quieter. Hayes paused for only a fraction of a second. "Routine administrative matter," he answered smoothly. "Nothing requiring our attention today." The lieutenant nodded and sat back down. Yet Danielle noticed several people exchange looks. They had heard the answer. More importantly, they had heard what was missing from it. Hayes continued speaking as though nothing had happened. But the room no longer felt completely under his control. Tiny fractures had begun appearing beneath the polished surface. Danielle could feel them spreading. The captain beside her glanced down again, and this time noticed a name printed across the top of one document partially visible inside the folder. His eyes widened slightly. He read it twice to make sure he had not imagined it. Then he looked at Danielle with an expression that was suddenly very different from before. Respect had quietly replaced curiosity. Across the room, Hayes continued talking, completely unaware that the first pieces of the truth were already beginning to emerge. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere inside the command center no longer felt as comfortable as it had 30 minutes earlier. Questions lingered beneath the surface like storm clouds gathering beyond the windows. Richard Hayes seemed determined to ignore them. He stood beside the display screen and advanced through another set of statistics, speaking with the same practiced confidence that had carried him through countless public appearances. Yet several people in the room had stopped paying attention to the presentation. Their focus had shifted elsewhere. Danielle Brooks noticed it immediately. The captain seated beside her kept glancing toward the folder resting on the table. Across the room, two division commanders quietly exchanged whispers. Even the young lieutenant who had mentioned the Inspector General's review appeared unsettled. Hayes clicked to another slide. This one displayed a summary of officer performance evaluations. Rows of percentages and rankings filled the screen. "These numbers reflect our commitment to accountability," he said. "We reward excellence and address concerns appropriately." Danielle lowered her eyes to a report inside her folder. A particular name caught her attention. Officer Ethan Morales, 29 years old, 7 years on the force. Consistently strong evaluations until 6 months earlier. Then suddenly, disciplinary concerns had appeared. The pattern stood out because it did not match the surrounding records. Danielle read the page again. Something about it felt incomplete. She turned another page, then another. The answer appeared almost immediately. Several supporting documents were missing. A recommendation memo had never been attached. Witness statements referenced in the report had vanished entirely. Danielle closed the folder halfway and looked toward the screen. Hayes was still discussing accountability. The irony was impossible to ignore. Her hand rose slightly. The movement was small, but several people noticed. The room gradually quieted. Hayes paused when he saw her. For a moment, his expression revealed mild surprise. Then amusement returned. "Yes," he asked. Danielle spoke calmly. "I have a question regarding Officer Morales." Several heads turned. Hayes folded his arms. "And you are?" A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Danielle remained composed. "I noticed missing documentation connected to his evaluation review." Silence followed. The room felt noticeably colder. Hayes stared at her for several seconds before smiling. It was not a friendly smile. "Those files are internal matters," he said. "Not something for visitors to concern themselves with." A few nervous laughs drifted through the room. Danielle did not react. "The missing records appear relevant," she replied. "Without them, the findings seem incomplete." The smile vanished from Hayes's face. His jaw tightened. The room became perfectly still. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere near the back wall, a coffee machine hissed and fell silent again. Hayes stepped away from the podium. "Let me explain something," he said. "This department has professionals handling these matters. We do not need outside spectators reviewing work they do not understand." Nobody laughed this time. The words hung heavily in the air. Danielle met his gaze without hesitation. Accuracy matters regardless of who notices the discrepancy. Several officers lowered their eyes toward the table. Others watched Hayes carefully. The chief's confidence remained intact, but irritation had begun to show beneath the surface. He glanced around the room, expecting support. Instead, he found uncertainty. The captain beside Danielle slowly closed his notebook. The young lieutenant sat motionless. Even some of Hayes's most loyal commanders appeared uncomfortable. Danielle rested one hand on the folder and waited. She had not raised her voice. She had not challenged his authority. She had simply pointed toward a fact. Yet somehow that fact had changed the temperature of the entire room. And for the first time that morning, Richard Hayes looked less like the man controlling the meeting and more like the man trying to regain control of it. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Richard Hayes stood near the front of the room with his hands resting on the edge of the podium. The confidence that had carried him through the morning remained visible, but now it competed with something else. Irritation. The room could feel it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Danielle Brooks sat quietly with her folder closed in front of her. She had asked a simple question. Nothing more. Yet that question continued hanging over the meeting like a storm cloud refusing to pass. Hayes finally broke the silence. "This briefing is not the place for speculative commentary," he said. His voice remained controlled, but the sharpness beneath it was impossible to miss. Several department heads shifted in their seats. Danielle remained calm. "I was referring to documented records," she answered. "Not speculation." A few people lowered their eyes toward the table. Others stared at their notes without reading a single word. The tension had become impossible to ignore. Hayes stepped away from the podium and began walking slowly around the conference table. The polished floor reflected the overhead lights beneath his shoes. "You seem very interested in how this department operates," he said. "More interested than someone sitting in on a meeting should be." He stopped a few feet from Danielle's chair. The entire room watched. "Perhaps you should leave departmental reviews to people with actual law enforcement experience." The words landed hard. Not because they were loud. Because everyone understood exactly what he was trying to do. The captain seated beside Danielle looked uncomfortable. The young lieutenant stared straight ahead. No one spoke. Danielle looked up at Hayes. Her expression never changed. "Professional oversight requires asking questions," she said quietly. "Especially when information appears incomplete." Hayes gave a short laugh. It was the kind of laugh people used when they wanted to dismiss someone without directly addressing what had been said. "Oversight," he replied. "You are making quite a few assumptions for someone who has not even introduced herself properly." A few nervous smiles appeared around the room, but they vanished almost immediately. The atmosphere had changed too much for anyone to enjoy the exchange. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows. The city beyond the glass appeared gray and distant. Inside the command center, every sound seemed amplified. The turning of notebook pages. The quiet hum of the air conditioning system. The ticking clock mounted near the rear wall. Danielle folded her hands together on the table. "Names are less important than facts," she said. Hayes stared at her for several seconds. The response clearly was not what he expected. His jaw tightened. For the first time all morning, uncertainty flickered across his face. It disappeared quickly, but not before several people noticed. Then the conference room doors opened. Every head turned. A uniformed administrative officer stepped inside, carrying a sealed envelope. He moved directly toward Hayes and handed it over without speaking. Hayes frowned slightly and glanced at the returned seal. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The room noticed immediately. He opened the envelope and scanned the first page. The confidence drained from his face so quickly it was almost invisible unless someone was watching carefully. Danielle was watching. So was everyone else. Hayes read the page again. Then a third time. The room remained silent. No one knew what was written inside the envelope. But they all understood one thing. Whatever information had just arrived was important. Very important. Slowly, Hayes lowered the document. Across the room, several officers exchanged uneasy looks. The meeting that had begun under his complete control no longer belonged entirely to him. And for the first time that morning, the man who believed he held all the authority looked like someone waiting for an answer he was not going to like. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound inside the command center was the steady rhythm of rain against the glass and the faint hum of the ventilation system above. Richard Hayes remained standing with the document in his hands, his eyes fixed on the page as though the words might change if he read them one more time. Around him, officers shifted quietly in their seats. Coffee cups sat untouched. Pens rested motionless above notebooks. The entire room seemed suspended between one moment and the next. Danielle Brooks sat calmly at the conference table, her posture unchanged. She had not asked what was written in the envelope. She did not need to. Whatever message had arrived, it was already speaking for itself. A pale stripe of morning light pushed through the storm clouds outside and stretched across the polished wood surface of the table. The reflection moved slowly, touching folders, badges, and folded hands. Danielle watched the light without saying a word. Her father used to call moments like this the truth before the truth. The quiet space where people began realizing something important was coming, even if they did not yet know what it was. Hayes finally lowered the paper and placed it beside the podium. His movements seemed slower now, more deliberate. Across the room, the young lieutenant glanced toward Danielle again. The captain seated beside her adjusted his glasses and looked down at the folder resting in front of her. He had seen enough names and seals to understand that she was not an ordinary visitor. The realization was spreading through the room one person at a time. Danielle folded her hands together. She thought about the officers whose files she had reviewed over the previous week. Men and women who had joined the department hoping to serve their communities. Some had made mistakes. Others had been treated unfairly. Most simply wanted leadership they could trust. That was why she was here. Not to embarrass anyone. Not to prove a point. To restore confidence where it had quietly eroded. The rain outside began to ease. Tiny streams of water slid down the windows more slowly now. Beyond the glass, the outline of the city became clearer. Buildings emerged from the gray haze. Traffic moved along distant streets. Life continued. Inside the room, the tension felt different than before. Less confrontational. More uncertain. As though everyone sensed a change approaching but could not yet see its shape. Hayes stared out the window for a brief moment before looking back toward the room. His usual certainty seemed distant. The command center that had felt entirely under his control earlier that morning now felt unfamiliar. Danielle noticed it in the way he stood. In the silence he could not fill. In the questions nobody had asked yet. She opened her folder slowly and turned to the next page. The soft sound of paper moving across paper seemed unusually loud. No one interrupted her. No one laughed. No one questioned why she was there. The room simply watched and waited. Somewhere beyond the closed conference room doors, footsteps approached. Steady, purposeful, getting closer with every second. The footsteps stopped outside the conference room doors. A second later, they opened. Every conversation died instantly. The police commissioner entered with two senior officials from the city administration walking beside him. Water still glistened on their coats from the rain outside. The room rose to its feet almost automatically. Chairs slid backward. Notebooks closed. Richard Hayes straightened immediately, the familiar confidence returning to his posture as he stepped forward to greet them. "Commissioner," he said with a measured smile. "We were just finishing the morning briefing." The commissioner nodded but did not return the smile. His eyes moved across the room before settling on a familiar face seated quietly near the end of the table. Danielle Brooks. For a brief moment, nobody seemed to notice the look of recognition that passed between them. Then the commissioner walked directly past Hayes. The room watched in silence. Hayes turned slowly as the commissioner stopped beside Danielle's chair. "Good morning," the commissioner said. "I hope your trip from Washington was not too difficult." Danielle stood and offered a small nod. The weather slowed traffic a little, but nothing serious. The room froze. Several people exchanged confused glances. The captain sitting beside Danielle nearly dropped his pen. Across the table, the young lieutenant stared openly. Hayes remained motionless. The commissioner turned toward the room. "Before we continue, there is an announcement I need everyone to hear." The silence deepened. Rainwater dripped softly from a coat near the doorway. Somewhere down the hallway, a phone rang and then stopped. Inside the conference room, nobody moved. The commissioner folded his hands behind his back. "Effective immediately, Deputy Commissioner Danielle Brooks will oversee the Federal Compliance Review and Departmental Accountability Initiative for this agency." The words landed with the force of a revelation. Faces changed across the room almost instantly. Confusion became realization. Realization became shock. Danielle remained calm. She had expected this moment. Hayes had not. The commissioner continued. "She has been granted full authority to review operational procedures, personnel evaluations, and oversight recommendations." He paused. "Including those currently under review." No one needed further explanation. The meaning was clear. Danielle was not a visitor. She was not an observer. She was not an outsider who had wandered into the wrong meeting. She was the person entrusted to evaluate the very department sitting before her. The captain beside her slowly leaned back in his chair. His expression reflected what everyone else was thinking. Every interaction from that morning suddenly looked different. Every assumption collapsed at once. Richard Hayes stood completely still. The confidence that had filled the room earlier seemed distant now. His eyes shifted toward Danielle. Memories of the morning replayed behind them. The jokes, the dismissive comments, the public attempts to diminish her. One by one, they returned with painful clarity. Danielle met his gaze without anger, without satisfaction, without triumph. The room waited for some dramatic response, but none came. She simply gathered her folder and placed it carefully on the table. The soft sound echoed through the silence. Then she looked around the room and spoke for the first time with the authority she had carried all along. "Thank you, Commissioner," she said. "Now, if everyone is ready, I would like to continue discussing Officer Morales' missing documentation." No one spoke after Danielle Brooks finished her sentence. The silence that followed felt entirely different from the one that had filled the room earlier that morning. Before, it had been the silence of uncertainty. Now it was the silence of realization. Officers who had spent the last hour watching the exchange finally understood what they had witnessed. Danielle had known exactly who she was from the moment she entered the building. She had known her authority. She had known her assignment. Yet she had never used either as a weapon. She simply opened her folder and turned to the section containing Officer Ethan Morales' records. The commissioner took a seat near the center of the table. Department leaders followed. Chairs moved quietly across the floor. Not a single person looked at Danielle the same way anymore. Richard Hayes remained standing for a moment before slowly returning to his chair. The movement seemed heavier than before. The confidence that once filled every gesture had been replaced by reflection. Danielle noticed it, but did not acknowledge it. Her focus remained on the documents. "Officer Morales received disciplinary findings 6 months ago," she began. However, supporting witness statements were never attached to the final review package. She slid copies across the table. Several supervisors examined the pages immediately. The captain beside her read through the documents twice before looking up. "These records were never included in the final file," he admitted quietly. Another commander nodded. "I have never seen these attachments either." Danielle listened without judgment. She had spent enough years in public service to understand that organizations often struggled not because of a few bad people, but because too many good people stopped asking difficult questions. Across the table, Hayes reviewed the same documents. His expression grew increasingly thoughtful. The missing records painted a very different picture of Officer Morales. Performance concerns that once seemed serious now appeared incomplete. Recommendations that had been ignored suddenly mattered. The facts that should have been considered had simply disappeared somewhere along the process. Danielle folded her hands. "My purpose here is not to assign blame," she said. "My purpose is to ensure accuracy." The words settled over the room. They carried no anger, no accusation, only conviction. The commissioner nodded approvingly. Several officers visibly relaxed. For the first time all morning, the meeting felt productive rather than defensive. Hayes looked down at the reports for a long moment. Then he slowly closed the folder. His eyes moved toward Danielle. "You could have revealed your position the moment you walked into this room," he said quietly. Every person at the table looked up. Danielle met his gaze. "I could have," she replied. "But that would not have told me what I needed to know." The answer lingered in the air. Hayes lowered his eyes briefly. The meaning was unmistakable. Authority had never been the point. Character was. The rain outside had finally stopped. Sunlight began pushing through the clouds, casting warm reflections across the conference table. The room felt brighter than it had all morning. Hayes exhaled slowly before speaking again. "Then let us correct the record," he said. Danielle offered a small nod. No victory crossed her face. No satisfaction. Only professionalism. And in that moment, many of the people around the table realized something important. True leadership was not measured by rank, title, or who spoke the loudest. It was measured by the ability to seek the truth even when doing so required humility. The meeting finally ended nearly 2 hours later. One by one, officers gathered their notebooks and folders before quietly leaving the command center. The tension that had dominated the morning was gone. In its place remained something calmer, something reflective. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows now. transforming the polished conference table into a sheet of gold. Outside, the city moved beneath clear skies as though the storm had never happened. Danielle Brooks remained seated for a few moments after everyone else began leaving. She reviewed a final page of notes, closed her folder, and stood. The room that had greeted her with assumptions and laughter now felt entirely different. Several officers paused on their way out to introduce themselves properly. Others thanked her for raising questions that had gone unasked for too long. Danielle accepted each conversation with the same quiet professionalism she had shown throughout the day. She neither celebrated nor criticized. She simply listened. Across the room, Richard Hayes remained near the windows overlooking the city. Most people had already left. The commissioner departed with several department executives. The captain who had spent the morning beside Danielle offered a respectful nod before disappearing into the hallway. Eventually, only 2 people remained in the command center. Hayes stood silently for a moment before turning toward her. The sunlight highlighted the silver in his hair. For the first time all day, there was no audience. No podium. No rank. No performance. Just 2 public servants standing inside a quiet room. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words arrived without hesitation. Danielle looked at him, but said nothing. Hayes continued, "I made assumptions before I knew anything about you. I was wrong." The honesty in his voice was unmistakable. Danielle held his gaze for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. "What matters now is what happens next," she replied. Hayes looked down briefly. "You had every reason to embarrass me today." "That was never my goal," Danielle said. Departments improve when people focus on solutions instead of victories. A faint smile appeared on Hayes's face. Not because he felt proud, because he understood. The lesson had finally reached him. He glanced toward the conference table where the reports still rested beneath the afternoon light. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent years believing leadership meant always being the strongest person in the room." Danielle adjusted the folder beneath her arm. "The strongest leaders are usually the ones willing to learn." The words settled gently into the silence. Neither person spoke after that. There was nothing left to prove. Hayes extended his hand. Danielle accepted it. The gesture was simple, respectful, final. A few minutes later, Danielle walked through the long hallway leading toward the elevators. Sunlight spilled across the marble floor in wide bands of gold. Her footsteps echoed softly through the nearly empty building. Officers passed and greeted her with quiet respect. She returned each greeting with the same calm smile. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside and turned toward the lobby below. The doors closed slowly. Upstairs, Richard Hayes remained standing beside the conference room windows. The city stretched before him beneath clear skies. Cars moved through the streets. People hurried along sidewalks. Life continued. He stood there in silence, watching the sunlight reflect from the buildings beyond the glass. The command center behind him was empty now. No applause. No speeches. No laughter. Only the quiet understanding that true authority was never about power over people. It was about character. And as the afternoon light filled the room, that lesson lingered long after the voices were gone.